In my previous video about 90s crime gems, the comments section became a goldmine of recommendations. You guys pointed out so many incredible films that I just couldn't ignore them. So today we're looking at 10 more 90s crime movies you said deserve more love. And make sure you stay until the end, because the last one is a real deep cut. Let's start with the film you brought up the most, State of Grace. This one had the worst possible timing. Released just days before Goodfellas, Phil Joanno's film was instantly overshadowed, and honestly that was probably inevitable. But while it might not stand in the same spotlight as Scorsese's masterpiece, it absolutely deserves to be part of the conversation. Set in Hell's Kitchen, a Manhattan neighborhood where old street loyalties still rule, the film follows Terry, played by Sean Penn, an undercover cop who returns home to infiltrate a local Irish-American gang. The problem is that this isn't just some criminal crew. It's tied to his childhood best friend, Jackie, and run by Jackie's older brother, Frankie. We've seen gangster stories about loyalty and identity plenty of times, but Penn brings something genuinely haunted to the role. Terry feels like a man who no longer belongs anywhere. Not with the cops, not with the gang, and not even in the neighborhood that made him. But the real lightning bolt is Gary Oldman. As Jackie, he's funny, terrifying, and completely unpredictable without ever turning into a cartoon. Every time he walks into a scene, the movie gets a jolt of electricity. Next up is Deep Cover. The story centers on Russell Stevens, a police officer haunted by his past. He can't escape the memory of his drug-addicted father, who was shot and killed while robbing a liquor store right in front of him when Stevens was a child. This trauma looms over him when he's recruited for a covert operation in Los Angeles, tasked with bringing down a major drug network. The film is packed with classic noir elements and everything you'd expect from an undercover story, but it's a surprisingly strong entry thanks to two powerhouse performances. Both Lawrence Fishburne and Jeff Goldblum delivered Independent Spirit Award-nominated turns here, and their energy really elevates the material. Deep Cover is never boring for a second. It's fast-paced, full of surprising twists, and loaded with memorable lines. The atmosphere is incredibly involving, as is the storyline, which puts these interesting characters right in the middle of some heavy moral dilemmas. As the film progresses, it keeps pushing the boundaries in ways you don't see coming. Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead is one of those 90s crime films that feels like it was built almost entirely out of attitude, dialogue, and bad decisions. Andy Garcia stars as a former mob associate who just has to do one last favor for the local boss before he's allowed to go straight. Of course, as is tradition in these stories, things don't go exactly as planned. Garcia does a solid job in the lead, but this is one of those movies where the supporting cast really steals the show. Christopher Walken is here, and he has that rare ability to elevate a film just by walking into it. Then you have Steve Buscemi, who once again proves he can do a lot with very little. He only has a handful of lines, but his creep factor as a quiet hitman is impossible to ignore. And yes, you can absolutely feel the post-Pulp Fiction wave hanging over this thing. The 90s were full of talky, stylish crime films built around violence, cool dialogue, and offbeat characters. A lot of them aged badly. This one still works because it's funny, well cast, and strange in all the right ways. Killing Zoe is a heist movie where the robbery almost feels like the least reckless decision anyone makes. Directed by Roger Avery and executive produced by Quentin Tarantino, it stars Eric Stoltz as Zed, an American safecracker who arrives in Paris to help his childhood friend Eric pull off a bank job. But this is not a clean, professional operation. Before the heist even starts, the crew burns through a wild night of drugs and booze, then decides to go ahead with the robbery on Bastille Day, convinced it will somehow make things easier. Of course, it only makes everything worse. Once the job begins, the whole thing starts collapsing under Eric's erratic, drug-fueled behavior. The violence gets uglier, the mood gets darker, and the film keeps undercutting it with pitch-black humor. Dead Presidents feels like a film that was hurt by the way it was sold. If you expected a straight gangster heist movie, I can see why it might have felt strange. The heist is there, but it's not really the point. It's the final result of everything that came before. The film follows Anthony Curtis, played by Larenz Tate, a young man from the Bronx who joins the Marines and returns from Vietnam to a country that has no real place for him. That's where the Hughes brothers aim higher than the advertising suggested. They're looking at Black Vietnam veterans coming home from war, neighborhoods being crushed by drugs and unemployment, and young men trying to survive after being used up. It doesn't land every idea perfectly, but the ambition is hard to ignore. And by the time the armored car robbery finally arrives, it feels less like a genre hook and more like a desperate move from men who have run out of options. Copland is one of James Mangold's lesser-known films and maybe one of his best. It also gives Sylvester Stallone one of those rare performances where critics actually took him seriously. And to be fair, he really is very good here. But the movie is much more than just Stallone can act. Mangold builds it around a New Jersey town populated by New York cops, and that setup gives the film its whole point. These men enforce the law somewhere else, then come home to a place where they behave like the law belongs to them. The story is not necessarily as complex as some of the better-known corrupt cop noirs, but it's full of interesting characters and a ridiculously strong cast. Stallone is surrounded by Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, and a scene-stealing Ray Liotta, which already tells you the movie is playing in a pretty serious league. You can feel the influence of Scorsese and Lumet in Mangold's craftsmanship, but Copland still has its own bruised working-class identity. It's a tough, solid crime drama that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Here's the question at the center of a simple plan. What would you do if you found around $4 million in the middle of nowhere and thought nobody could ever trace it back to you? That's the trap Sam Raimi sets here. 3 small-town men discover a crashed plane in the woods with a fortune in ransom money inside and decide to keep it. At first, it almost sounds logical. No witnesses, no obvious owner, no reason anyone should know. But the second they make that choice, the whole film starts tightening around them. The film was critically praised, but it failed at the box office. And because it sits between Raimi's cult horror years and his Spider-Man era, it still feels like one of his great hidden gems. Romeo Is Bleeding is a great reminder of what Gary Oldman can do when he's not just stealing scenes from the side, but carrying the whole movie. He plays Jack Grimaldi, a corrupt police detective already sliding downhill before he gets involved with Mona, a ruthless Russian assassin played by Lena Olin. The setup is pure noir, and the fun is watching Oldman slowly fall apart while pretending he still has a plan. He is never boring here. He can sell panic, guilt, arrogance, and desperation without making the character feel too clean or too sympathetic. But Lena Olin is the real threat. Her character doesn't hide the danger at all. She walks into the movie like a warning sign, and Jack ignores it anyway. It's stylish, darkly funny, and overheated in exactly the way a good crime noir should be. True romance is not exactly a secret, but if the comments section insists, I'm not going to argue. It's always nice to have an excuse to revisit a good film. Directed by Tony Scott from Quentin Tarantino's script, it begins in Detroit with Clarence Worley, played by Christian Slater, a comic book store clerk and movie geek who marries Alabama, played by Patricia Arquette, and then accidentally walks away with the wrong suitcase after confronting her pimp. The problem is that the suitcase belongs to the mob, and Clarence decides the smart move is to take it to Hollywood and sell the drugs inside. On paper, it's a lovers-on-the-run crime story. In practice, it's Tarantino dialogue filtered through Tony Scott's speed and color. You can feel Tarantino in every tough guy speech and sudden burst of violence, but Scott gives the whole thing a romantic, almost feverish momentum. The movie keeps pushing everyone toward collision. Lovers, cops, gangsters, and Hollywood hustlers, all closing in until everything explodes in that famously chaotic final standoff. And yes, if you're keeping count, this is Gary Oldman's 3rd appearance on the list. And for those of you who stayed until the end, I saved a real deep cut. Delusion. Huge thanks to the viewer who brought this one up, because honestly, I hadn't seen it myself. As far as I can tell, finding this thing properly on disc is basically impossible, but I'll leave a link in the description because the whole movie is on YouTube. The film follows George O'Brien, played by Jim Metzler, a former computer executive driving across Nevada with stolen money hidden in his trunk. He picks up Patty, a former Vegas showgirl played by Jennifer Rubin, only to realize she comes with baggage, her boyfriend Chevy, played by Kyle Secor. And Chevy isn't just some annoying loudmouth, he's a hitman on his way to kill someone. After the hit, Chevy takes off in George's car, sending George chasing after the money. It starts like a crime caper, gets nastier as it goes, and by the end almost feels like a spaghetti western. It's low budget, odd, and completely off the radar, but if you love forgotten 90s neo-noirs, definitely check it out.